Question? Well, your table came up. So do each of you get? Are you splitting the 1%, a quarter of a percent each? Well, let's see. I think we might have a winner. So I think we've got a pretty decisive winner with Control-Alt-PC. All right. So Control-Alt-PC was the brainchild of Ryan G. All right. So Ryan, you may have to remind me at the end of the semester. All right. Thank you for the suggestions. Okay. So for 1 additional percent by next week's class, if anybody wants to take a stab at creating our Control-Alt-PC logo, we can display those, and the most popular logo will also get a bonus percent at the end of the course. All right. Yep. Yes, I am old enough to. I am old enough to remember that. Okay, so we should have, as your .NET Core SDK, it should have installed by now over the break. So let's open up Visual Studio. I'm going to use 2017 simply because I'm assuming most people have 2017 from last year. So I'll just stick with 2017. So basically what we want to do is just set the project up and get it running, and we'll play around just a little bit. You know, we kind of, in theory, talked about how MVC works, but we'll actually play around for just a few minutes, and then we'll get into a little review with Git and GitHub in your lab. So in Visual Studio opens, we're going to create a new project. So we'll click File, New Project. And we want to make sure we're under the Visual C# tab. And then we want to choose Web. So if we choose Web, and when we installed Visual Studio, we picked the web components, we should get these 2 options. So .NET Core or .NET Framework. So this is the old version. We're not going to use it. That's what I've used in previous courses. I'm going to use .NET Core. I'm going to always create a new Git repository. Okay. So this will initialize Git in my folder. I want to keep this create directory checked, and I'll save it inside of my, I've got a folder for our course. You can save it anywhere you want, and I will call it, what are we calling it? I'll call it Control-Alt-PC. Don't put any spaces in. Okay? So either use camel or Pascal case, underscores or hyphens, but no spaces. Yeah. If the option says add to source control, it's the same thing as create Git repository. So make sure you enable that. And I'll show you why we want to enable that in a minute. Make sure you save it on your, question? Which option? Okay, don't worry about it. Okay, we can do it after. Just, it's Jacob, right? Remind me if I miss it, say, hang on, show me how to do it when we get there. Okay, so make sure you pick core, give it a name. I've called mine Control-Alt-PC. You'll notice the naming convention I've used, the style is called Pascal case. This is Microsoft's preferred naming convention. So it's like camel case, except in camel case, the first word is all lowercase. In Pascal case, every individual word starts with a capital. And that's how Microsoft has, for decades, preferred to name things. So I'm going to stick with that convention. So I'll click OK, and then we'll get some more options. It'll start creating the project. Your screen may look a little different, especially if you're in 2019. Because I picked core, it asks which version of the .NET Core software development kit I want. So we may as well pick the latest one. If you don't have 2.2, that's fine. If you have 2.1 or 2.0, it's not that different, so it's okay. But you should all have 2.2 because that's what we all just installed before the break. So I'll pick 2.2. So here's the different stuff. We can get an empty project. We can do an API, which is basically simply a controller and model with no front end, right? A service, a web service for other applications to talk to. And we'll do that later on in the semester. There's web application. We can actually do templates for Angular and React front ends, which we won't have time to do in this course. We'll play around with Angular or React in our next course. And if you're in programmer, you'll do that in the JavaScript frameworks course in your next semester. But we want this option, web application with MVC. We'll leave this checked, configure for HTTPS. What does that do? We should always leave that on. Right, it means that it's going to run with an SSL certificate, which every website we build, we'll talk about SSL later, should always have SSL, because now if your website, even if it's just HTML and CSS, Chrome will mark it in the top as not secure if there's no SSL certificate. So it's now something we should have for every application. Do not check Docker. Docker is pretty cool, but it will use lots of resources and it's way outside the scope of our class. Dockers are cloud containers, so we can put an application in a container, then we can move that container from server to server. And it contains all the infrastructure that app needs beyond the scope of our class. We do want to change this. So it defaults to no authentication. Eventually, when users are shopping in our store, or if we're an administrator, we're going to need credentials to be able to manage the product catalog. So we're going to hit change, and we're going to change this to individual user accounts. That means users can either register with an email address and password, and we'll save them to our SQL Server database, or later on, it also includes libraries for adding social authentication. So you can shop at the computer store with, say, a Google or Microsoft login. We may have time to implement Facebook as well. We'll do that stuff later on in the semester. So pick individual user accounts. And then finally, okay. So there's our option: core, web MVC, HTTPS, and individual user accounts. And yes, you guys have probably had class in this room before. Just a reminder, the dress code at Georgian is wear layers because the temperature in a 3-hour class will change 10 degrees. And there is a thermostat here. It doesn't work. It's not; those are not connected to anything, so I have no control over the temperature. Linda, I see you. I see you silently shivering. I feel you. This room is generally freezing, and then for 20 minutes it'll get hot before it gets freezing again. Seems to be how it works. So we'll let this chug along. So here's our project, and you notice it sets up the MVC structure right away. We've got, so here's what our project looks like. Controllers, it gives us a default controller called home. No models yet, well, just for errors, but we'll build our own models. We have a few views. This file here, appsettings.json, this is our configuration file. So, for example, things like our database connection so that it can be read globally, it'll live here. If we have things like file paths or mail server credentials, we'll store all that kind of stuff in appsettings.json. And then we have this www root folder. These are all the front-end assets, CSS, front-end JavaScript, favorite icon, things like that. And then in here we have dependencies, and Microsoft's package manager is called NuGet. So these are, so right now there are two dependencies. There's the .NET Core dependency, and then this library called Razor. Razor is the name of the view syntax. And one of the nice things about ASP.NET views, the syntax for representing server-side data is much cleaner than it is in PHP, where we have those clunky opening PHP and closing PHP tags around any server-side values. That syntax is much more lightweight and cleaner and easier to see and less error-prone in .NET. Visual Studio also comes with its own built-in web server. So to get this running, we don't need a separate server. Microsoft's IIS web server, a light version of it, is baked right into Visual Studio. So if we want to launch the application, all we need to do, there's two options. You can press this button, which I wouldn't. What this does will compile the site, launch the server in a browser, but this means the debugger mode is on. And when the debugger mode is active, if you remember from your class with Keith, when the debugger is running, you can't make changes to your code. You have to press stop, wait for it to stop, then make changes, start it again. So instead of this, typically to start it, I click the debug menu, and I prefer this option. I won't click it yet. That will start the server and launch my site in my default browser, but the debugger isn't running, so I can still make changes to the code. Now, I'm going to do one other thing first. I'm going to right-click my solution, the very top item here, and I'm going to choose Open in File Explorer. I want to look at my project in my operating system for a minute. So this will jump me into my Control-Alt-PC folder. So here's what we get. We get a solution. This is basically just a text file. Because I checked off Add to Git or Add to Source Control, it created a Git folder and automatically added a Visual Studio specific git ignore file. So all of the standard Visual Studio stuff doesn't have to be included unnecessarily in my repository when I put this on GitHub. This whole thing, if we check it out, so it's 8 megabytes so far. This is one of the other benefits of Core. If we had picked the old version, the .NET framework, and created a web application, the template is actually 130 megabytes. So there's way more stuff added in the old version. .NET Core, they said, we're not going to add much in. You add in the pieces you want, rather than us giving you a million pieces and you deciding what to take out. So it's pretty small. And we talked about the compiled code. That's what this folder. Notice you don't see this bin folder in Visual Studio. It exists on disk, but it doesn't exist. We don't see it. So in bin, when I go in here right now, there's actually nothing here. The reason nothing is here is we've never compiled the site, so we don't have a DLL containing our source code. So if we want to compile it, if I just first click on build and build my solution, we shouldn't get any errors because we haven't broken anything yet. So it should be able to build successfully. We'll just give it a minute. So it says it's successfully built, and now it's created inside bin debug .NET Core 2.2. It's now created a DLL with the name of our project. And if you named your project something else, that's fine. I don't care what you named it. So now if I go back here, here is so this is the file that we would have to put on the web server in order for our code to run. We don't have to put any of the .cs files, all our C# source code, we can keep it. We don't have to push that up to the web server. Just our HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and the bin folder. So actually I could maybe show you what this looks like if I can think of a .NET app I've got running, an MVC app somewhere. Let's see. So this is an old one. These files have ASPX extensions. So you notice there's no C# code. These are just the web pages and the CSS, simple CSS, and here's the bin folder with the DLL. But the source code is not on the server and has never been. I have a copy of it, and I back it up in the cloud in case I lose my machine or it gets damaged. So it will be the same when we deploy our MVC sites. We don't have to put the source code up on the server. Okay, so now to get it running, if I actually want to see what we have, if I click debug and I'll start without debugging, you'll notice a couple things. Remember, we checked off HTTPS, so it gives us HTTPS. We have SSL running. And it runs on localhost, and Visual Studio randomly assigns a different port to every project. So if we've got 10 websites we're building, each one will run on a different port. Now, you may have an SSL error here. You may get a warning, a security warning. Does anybody get a security warning? You do? So if you click advanced, it'll say it doesn't like our SSL because it's self-signed. It wasn't issued from a certificate authority that it recognizes. So you can just click, there's an option to add a security exception. If you need me to have a look, I can look. There should be a way to override that security warning. If you're using Chrome or Edge, you may get the warning may look a little different. Okay. So this is what we get with .NET Core. We get Bootstrap 4, right? We've got a mobile responsive layout already.
I have been. I just don't know what
So we get our little collapsible menu. We get a couple of links. So we don't have to use Bootstrap. We can get rid of it. But we also have our own default style sheet, which we can override. Right? So we can either download a theme or we can customize the CSS here inside of www.root CSS. There's our file. So you can make any changes you like to the look and feel of the site here. And we'll play around a little bit with this, but we won't get too carried away. Not really our focus here. We'll maybe look for a Bootstrap 4 template later and just add that in. We'll just add a kind of a canned theme to it. So it looks a little better than this. I'm sure this offends some of the designers in the room. Just getting the base Bootstrap template. Okay. So you can go ahead and make any CSS changes you want. So let's look at how this works, right? So we've got a link here. If I click privacy, notice the URL, /home/privacy. So what you can probably tell from this link is that we have a controller called home, and in there, we're gonna find a method called privacy. So let's kind of look under the hood at what happens here. So inside of controllers, if I open up my home controller, we actually have three methods. We've got an index method, privacy method, which we just invoked, and then we've got an error method. So a couple things to note about these methods. Each one returns what's called an action result. Most of the time, in like 99% of the time in our MVC apps, the action we want to perform is we want to return a view to the user, right? We want to load a web page in the browser. So that's what's happening here. When they click index, when they click the home link, it calls index, which returns the home page. When they click privacy, like I just did, it returns a view. Occasionally, we might return something else. We might not return a view to the user. What would be an instance where we might give them back something other than a web page to see in their browser? Well, what might get returned here instead? Right, we could return an HTTP status code of 404 not found. Or potentially, depending on what we're doing, maybe a particular method is just going to return some JSON to be used in some other way. So most of the time, these action results will return views, but not always. Okay. Now, how does it know which, notice each of these, so index returns view and privacy returns view, but it doesn't actually say which view to return. How do you suppose it knows which page is supposed to load? When we're not actually specifying the name here, and we don't specify the name here either. Yet, if I click home, it loads this, and if I click this, it loads this. Dustin? Your assumption is bang on. So naming conventions are important. We've got methods in the home controller called index and privacy. Inside of views, we have a home subfolder with two views, index and privacy. So let's add a new link. Let's add a new method, a new view, and a new link to the navbar so we can see what does this process look like of how we add a new page to an MVC site. So typically, there's different ways of doing it. I find the easiest way is to start in the controller. Let's start in the back and work our way forward. So I'll create a new method. So let's call this about. So we'll want an about link in our navbar. User clicks it. We can give them a little blurb about our store. So it will return a view. Now we can manually go down here and create the view, but there's an easier way to do it. Remember, Visual Studio is all about automating stuff. Microsoft said, what are the repetitive, mindless tasks web developers are constantly doing, and how can we automate as many of these as possible? So they can focus on the design and the logic and functionality of the site, not on doing repetitive stuff. So here's the easy way. If I right-click my method, at the top, I have an option in this context menu that says Add a View. So I'll click that, and it brings up this little dialog. What's the name? Well, it automatically copies the method name, which was about. And then it asks me for a template. So later on, it has all these baked-in templates. Are we doing a create? Are we showing a list? It'll automatically format our view according to what the functionality is. For now, we're not working with any model, so we're going to pick empty. So the model class is empty. And then down here, we have this use a layout page. So Visual Studio also builds us, we'll look at it in a minute, builds us a default site template that includes Bootstrap, it includes jQuery, it includes a default header and footer. We can get rid of all that stuff, or we can make any changes we want to it. So where this is checked off, it says use a layout page. I'll just click this little browse button. And our default layout page is under views and shared. We have this underscore layout file. So this is our template. So Visual Studio gives us this template. We can get rid of it. We can modify it. Or we might make a series of templates. Maybe we have different parts of the site for different users. And each area has a totally different layout and different components. So we might have, a customer template, an admin template, a supplier template, and every time we make a view, we can say which template should this view use. So I'm going to pick my layout template and click OK. Okay. So my name is add, the template is empty, and we're using our shared layout. I could do the same thing here. I could just right-click this folder and choose add view and do it the same way. But by doing it, by right-clicking my method name, I'm ensuring that my view, my name, and my method name are the same. Because as Dustin pointed out, that's the convention. It will automatically know which page to load if those names match. So I'll just click add. Haven't forgotten your. Oh, okay. So you can create a different page. Okay, mine doesn't, but yeah, if you already have an about, you can create a different page. So here's our view. Super lightweight. Right? It has a title. And if we wanted to change the template, we could just change the template here. And then it simply has an H1 tag on it. And it gets added down here, again with Pascal case, capital A. So let's try and load it. We don't have a link yet in the navbar, but what happens now if I go to home/about? Every time we rebuild the site, the first load is slow. And then then the DLL gets cached and subsequent requests are faster. But the first request after a build will always be slow. Okay. So now it loads our view. So if we want to add content on here, right, I can just put on static HTML. It's just like any other HTML page. Let's look at our home page, actually. So let's look at how do we get it in our nav bar? Notice the navigation bar, it's not in this file. Where would we have to go if we want to modify the navigation bar? Which file would contain it? Yeah, the layout file, right? So this page uses our layout. So if we go down to shared and open up our layout, so we've got our link to Bootstrap. Again, if you don't want Bootstrap, you can get rid of it. We've got a link to our custom CSS. If we want to add additional CSS, add fonts, etc., we would probably add it to the layout file, and that way it's shared globally. Here's our collapsible Bootstrap header, which we'll come back to in a minute. This is the .NET version of rendering a server-side value. That render body, that's a server-side method. So instead of these awful PHP tags around our values, where we have, let's see. So in PHP, we'd have to write this opening and closing tag around any server-side value. So much easier in .NET, just put an @ symbol. Visual Studio says, hey, that's a server-side value, it puts it yellow. So this is where our page content gets injected, inside of this main tag. We've got our footer down at the bottom. Maybe I can add to the footer, add something. I'll just put in our course code. We've already got jQuery enabled if we want it. If you don't want it, you can get rid of it. As well as we have a custom site.js. That's for our own custom client-side JavaScripts. So we can write them there, and they're already in the footer available. Right? If I just refresh, my footer should change. I'll get the course code here. So now we want to add a link in our navbar. So I'm going to jump up. So here's our navbar, lines 31 to 38. So they look mostly like regular links with a few exceptions. So in between home and privacy, I want to add a new link to our new page. So I'll add an LI. With the nav item class. But you'll notice there's a few extra attributes here, which are bold and in purple inside of our A tags. Not going to worry about the ASP area. We're not really going to use that. But as you can see, these should be fairly self-explanatory what they do. So instead of using standard HTML links, we could just write this as a regular link and it would work. We could just do ahref equals /home/about. That would work. But here we're being more intentional that we're using the MVC pattern. We're not just linking from one page to another. Our link actually calls an action in a specific controller. And that controller is then responsible for loading the view. So we're going to add these ASP controller. Again, we're using our home controller. And what action do we want to call? Yeah, we want to call the about link. And our link will also have the text of about. So if we save that and go back to our browser, we now should have a new link. And the green over on the left, this shows you new code, right? So these lines in green, line 35 to 37, those are new. I'll just go back and test it out. So now about loads our about view. So the nice thing about our MVC, our separation of concerns, is if we want to display a whole bunch of server-side data here, all of the logic to get that data, that's all going to live in here. None of that code belongs in our view. The only thing that belongs in the view is those little @ symbols and where we're outputting the value with our HTML formatting. We don't query the database. We don't perform any logic at all inside of our view. So our syntax is much, much cleaner. Actually, I can show you a quick example of one. Let's see. Here's a .NET MVC app some students are working on. So in here, we've got, one of the things we have is a list of employers. So we have an employer model that looks like this. So this defines what an employer looks like in the database. It has an ID, it has a name that's required, it has a location, it's got contact info. So this kind of matches what the table looks like in our database. And also in here, we've got an employer controller. And in here, we've got an index method. We check if the user's logged in. And if they are, we query the database, go and get a list of employers, sort them alphabetically, and pass them to an index view. So one of the other great things is we don't have to write any SQL. All of our interactions with the database are using this shorthand. So just say this just goes and gets them all in this order. Put them in a list, load the view called index, and hand this list. So the view, we're looking at the view syntax. If I go to views and employers, here's the index view. Okay. So here's our layout file. We've got a heading and then a bootstrap table. And then you just see we've got the @ symbol. There's our table headings, and we have a simple loop where we display all the employers in a loop. Our code is much easier to write. It's much easier to read, update, and maintain because all the back-end stuff lives in the models and controllers. It's all separate, right? And then we can work on this together. Right? And actually, Envy's been involved in this project. He knows a bit about it, right? Envy could do the views, and Sam is a co-op employer. Sam could do the controllers and models and say, Envy, you just do the views. We'll give you the data. You just display it. Right? You're not involved in the back end of things. All right. Now, if we want, as Dustin mentioned, so by default, this is designed so that the method names will always load a view by that name. If we want our method to load a view with a different name, that's okay. We would just specify. So long as I had a view called some other view name here, my about method would be able to load it. But the convention is the method and the view names, they match. And the way this is set up is actually through here. I'll just show you where this is. We have a startup file here. So in startup, there's a configure method. Says whether we're in development or in production, are we using HTTPS? And here's the default. So by default, our URLs are mapped this way, right? The first part of our URL, that's the name of the controller. And the default one is home, and then it's the name of the method and any parameter. So as long as we follow this naming convention, we could add 1 million pages to the site. All we have to do is figure out what controller do the methods go in, name the method, and then use Visual Studio to create the views. And then we customized every view as we need to. Okay. I think we will, let's see. Okay. So there's our application. We didn't do too much. I think we wrote 3 lines of code today. We let Visual Studio do the rest, right? Baby steps. We'll do more next week. So now the last thing I want to do is I want to push my code up to GitHub. So I'm not going to make a new repository every week because we're just going to keep working on this one project. So every week at the end of class, I'll just make a new commit to my repository. So we initialized Git at the beginning, so I don't have to run like the git init command. Git's already tracking this project. So here's what I want to do to get it up on GitHub. We'll do it through Visual Studio. It's quite quick. I'm going to go to GitHub, and I'm going to make a new repository. So I'm just going to go here. I'm going to create a new repository, which I will call COMP2084 Fall 2019. This is our Control-Alt-PC. So all I'm going to do is give it a name. The description is optional. Do not check the README. We'll create a README file later. I don't want to create a README. It will break things. We don't need a gitignore file. We already have a gitignore file on our computers. Visual Studio generated it. So just give it a name with no spaces and click create. You can make yours private if you want. Obviously, mine needs to be public, so everyone's got access to it. I'm just going to click create repository. Now, maybe next week we'll go over the command line version of this. I'm just going to do this through Visual Studio. It's pretty simple. So once your repository is created, all you really need to do is copy the URL to your clipboard. Or you can just go right here and copy it from here. So we need to get the address of our remote repository because I need to connect this remote repository to my local project through Visual Studio. So I'm going to go back to Visual Studio and I'm going to use this window. It's called Team Explorer. If you don't see it here, you can turn it on through the View menu. You click View, Team Explorer is the fourth option in the list. I'm going to go to Team Explorer. Now, my Visual Studio is already connected to my GitHub account. I'm already logged in. Yours may not be. So I'll show you how to connect them if they're not connected. So the first thing to do here is on Team Explorer, click on Settings. So click on the Home button, and then you have this Settings link. So go to Home and Settings, and then you click on this Global Settings button. And it will ask you for your GitHub username and the email address associated with your GitHub account. Okay, I may have to come and look at it. Give me a second. Yep, so Home, Settings, Global Settings. So put in your GitHub credentials here. And once you do, there should be a button to update or save. Once you've done that, go back to Home again. And then we can click on Changes. So it will show which files we've changed, right? So I changed the layout, about, and my home controller. So I'm going to put in a commit message. It's really important to use descriptive names for your commits. If you don't in your assignments, you lose marks. If you put in commit 1, commit 2, or made some updates, made some updates, made some updates. Why is it important that you actually describe what you did? Sandra? Right, because if you break something tomorrow, you need to know which version, in which version you made which changes. How often should you commit to GitHub? So you're working on a project, like if you're actually out working and you're working on a web application and that's your job every day. How often do you think you should commit your changes to GitHub? What's reasonable? Minimum at the end of your workday. Every day. You should never lose more than a day's worth of work. I will typically commit to GitHub every time I've made a major change. Like I might make several commits in a day. So this project that Envy's been working on, let's see how many commits there are. You can actually see. So this project's been going on for a while. So there's 101 commits here. Yeah, and this is just the server. So, and everyone is descriptive. Who's doing what? So you should never lose your work. So now I can commit and push in one operation if I just click this little arrow. That'll make a new commit. So take a new snapshot of the version and it will push it to GitHub. Now, when you do this, you're probably going to get an error. It's going to say no remote repository configured. Actually, I may get it the same. Let's see. Let's see, commit and push. Right. So then I get this. There is no remote configured. So I've made a local commit, but it's not connected to my GitHub repository I created. If I click this button, publish, now I can just paste in my URL. So this will connect up my local project on my laptop to that GitHub repository I just made. So now if I click publish, I won't have to do this part repeatedly. This is just once. I have to connect these up today, and then they'll be connected in the future. I can just commit and push. So now if I go back to changes, it says there are no changes. And if I refresh my repository here up on GitHub, my code's backed up. So now if something happens to my machine, I get a virus, it gets stolen, my house burns down with my machine in it, my code is here. So on the assignments I give you in class, there will actually be marks for making regular commits to GitHub, because I want everybody to be in the habit of, this is my workflow. When I'm done working for the day, my code gets archived here so it doesn't get lost. Or if I break something, I can always go back and get an earlier version. Okay. So I'm going to quickly show you your lab. The lab should take you about 5 minutes to do. You have until Friday, 5 o'clock to do it. Okay. So it's in the assignments tab. It's quite simple. You don't have to write any code at all. If you have an issue with GitHub, if there's nobody in here, I can stick around for a few minutes after. If not, I am recording it, so the steps are going to be on YouTube. Okay. So here's the lab. You're basically going to repeat what we just did together. You're going to create a new .NET Core web application, call it Lab 1. You don't have to include any authentication at all, okay? But make sure you check off add to source control or create Git solution. All I want you to do is create a new project using the template. You don't have to write any code or change anything. Create a new Lab 1 repository on GitHub and push your boilerplate code there. All you need, your assignment can be public, it doesn't have to be private. All you need to do on Blackboard is just include the link to your repository. So I can click your link and your project should look like this. Don't give me this project, I want you to make a new one that's called Lab 1. Okay, this is our in-class one we're going to do together. So don't take this one. I want you to go through the steps right from the beginning of how do I create a new project from the beginning and get it up on GitHub. Okay, you have to write no code. You don't have to make any changes to the project. Create it, put it on GitHub, give me the GitHub repository link, and that's it. Right? Some of you will probably have this finished before I walk back to my office. And that's 2.5% of your final mark. So should be fairly simple. Okay. If you prefer to use the command line or the GitHub desktop tool, that's fine. Use any method you like that you're comfortable with of interacting with GitHub. I just showed you this tends to be the easiest when we're doing ASP.NET. I can maybe go over the command line version. The commands are actually here. I put them on Blackboard. And I know I'm over time and I should stop talking, but I'll show you where they are if you want them. So inside of tools and resources, if you like using the command line or you want to try it, here are all the commands you need, both to set up GitHub and then to commit and push. 5 commands. Init, add, commit, remote, add, push. You're done. All right, so that's it for today. So my code is up on GitHub. We'll keep working on it. Again, if you want to design a logo, bring it to class for next week. We will have a review quiz on what we did today to start a class next week about just some of the basics. All right, have a great week. I'll see you next week. Just give me a minute here to stop my video stream and put it in the right playlist.